Pass the baton back and forth depending on who's leading the different bits of the presentation. And I bet not stand in the way of the slides. That would be really awkward. That's going to severely restrict my freedom of movement. Okay, so Mark and Giles, we've already been identified. These Giles speak. Good morning, everyone. There's nowhere for me to stand on this thing. It's very awkward. I know what to do. Yeah, after all. So, the basic story we begin with is the fact that we're seeing a huge shift with the rise in interest of mobile approaches. But we also have to basically see what this graph is reminding us is that desktop is still the dominant way in which people are actually doing stuff. I mean, it's all very much to say there's lots of mobile devices out there. It's all very well to say that's what's selling and getting a lot of the market. But the question is, how are people actually generating money for their businesses? Well, it's still coming a great deal from desktop. There's a client of ours in Australia where they put a lot of effort into building a very nice mobile application for, in their case, the iPhone, which is the dominant platform for their customer segment. It's the way Australia is. And even so, they get a huge amount of their traffic comes through desktops or through mobile web apps. It's still a case that the desktop is a big picture. What's interesting is that the mobile scene is growing while the desktop isn't. Now, whether what's going to happen in the future with these lines, we don't know. Will mobile end up crossing and passing desktop? We don't know at this stage. But it's important to realise that the desktop is a big picture, but mobile's growth is what makes it interesting. And it's mobile's growth that is making us ask, where do we go from here?
And historically, we've seen development efforts treat mobile as effectively a smaller, poorer sibling.com. And what we can say now, from looking at this graph and the graphs that Horace showed us earlier, that you don't want to be thinking like that anymore. It's clear now where the growth is coming from, and to really tap into that growth and understand what you can do differently and what you can gain from that, you can't treat it as just something on the side. Now, a side effect, though, of that historical treating it as something on the side has resulted in mobile application development often operating in a smaller, leaner, startup style fashion, even within some very large, very slow-moving enterprises that we've seen internationally. And you really don't want to get rid of that, obviously. There must be some way of tapping the two things, combining them together, treating them as a first-class development and delivery effort, but also still retaining that energy that you've historically seen.
So in talking about strategy, we're going to break it down into three broad areas. One is, what is our overall vision that we want to have for the kind of products that we want to take? Because we think the vision is kind of that broad picture that has to act as a starting point. Then, how can we tease out some guiding principles that will say, how do we go about thinking about building things? And then, what other methods are actually going to use to get there? And this, we're going to show as a sequence, but it's all important to remember it's a cycle. Because it's your knowledge of the principles and methods of delivery will alter what's realistic in terms of your product vision. But we will begin at that product vision. And a good way of thinking about how desktop and various mobile approaches can have that overall picture is this little classification of how people are using the different devices. So, with the new devices such as tablets and phones, although they're both touchscreen devices, and they only vary depending on how big they are, the way we use them is significantly different. Because there's different circumstances that we find that we're operating. And in particular, we have this very interesting phenomenon that where you use the device causes a change into how you're going to use that device depending upon which kind of approach you're using. If you're using a laptop or desktop machine, okay, you may not have the CRT computer screens anymore, but there's still a certain assumption about how you're going to use it that's fairly regular. You're going to be sitting down, you're going to have a fairly good concentration on that, you're going to be in a sort of workish mode. When we move to a tablet device, then things are a bit different. I tend to use a tablet differently, and I have a different feel of interaction with it. And it can vary. Am I using it because I'm standing around waiting for a train? Am I using it because I'm sitting in bed? There's always a different circumstances there. And then those circumstances change even more when it comes to a mobile device. I'm much more likely to be using it in the middle of doing something else. There's a much wider range of cases that we have.
And we can also look at these new models, and we think that this is why mobile has had this growth. That the historical growth that we've seen in computing has all been tapping into what can you do in this lean forward mode. And Luke referred to this earlier today about how historically technology has made us come to it. And that's taken us a long way. We've seen a lot of growth, a lot of interesting products and technological developments along those lines. With lean back and look down, we're now having technology come to us. And looking at these models, we think there are a couple of areas and ways of thinking about what you do with your products that are worth considering. So firstly, when we're looking at your product, and that the product that you've already got is already available through standard desktop web application or website or whatever, however it surfaces. When you're considering what features that currently exposes and which ones you should expose over mobile, we think that selecting the features based on some form of user context. The user context you use will differ depending on what context is available, what makes sense for your product. But broadly, it's kind of three really critical ones would be location, obviously everyone thinks about that. Time is a big deal as well. And finally, what's in the user's wallet. It's kind of tied up with their identity, who they are, but you can think of it in a slightly less creepy way by saying what's in their wallet that I put there. And we think this applies mainly in the look down mode. That's your handset. That's your so a good example of that will be tickets, any kind of ticketing travel application. You want to be able to pull your phone out and just get straight to the ticket. Another example would be the contact us portion of a standard website. It's a boring part of your website, right? You've got to have it. It's pretty boring. If you're the kind of company that wants your clients to get in contact with you, call you up, talk to you, and not everyone wants their clients talking to them, be reasonable, being honest about that. But if you are that kind of company, then your contact us can be done a little bit interestingly. Because rather than just showing that static list of here's all our offices, tap on one of those offices, shows you the address, maybe that links off to Google Maps, you know, something really cool there, your phone number, maybe you tap that and it offers to dial. Take it a step further. Because location is tied up with a handset, why don't you find out where they are and show them the office closest? And now, that's neat, it's great, but you've still got a couple of taps to get to that. How about when you go to your company's website on a handset, that's actually the first thing it shows you. Because what are they probably doing? If they're pulling their handset out to look at your website, there's a good chance that they're trying to find an office, and it's probably the office closest to where they are. If you run events, user events or events like today, that might be something they're looking for. So put that up there as well. But you wouldn't do this on the tablet version of the site or your desktop version because, well, you don't know the context, it's not available to you. Those are also much more a browse and deep engagement model, where the people are willing and are more able, due to the constraints of the device, to explore. Also, if you're thinking about features, now we mentioned that the two models on the right, lean back and look down, are new. The result of them being new means that there are plenty of opportunities for offering features there. And we think when you're deciding what features to offer, look for where there are gaps. What are the things that someone currently can't really do effectively or it doesn't look to do? Then that's something that might be worthwhile exposing on a tablet device. So a client we have in Australia that I worked with for a little while was interested in 2 sort of mining a very large collection of classified data to increase people's engagement with the website. And that would be they offer this ability to put this together and kind of come up with ideas for what your home and your house should look like. Just pulling photos that are already collected as part of classifieds, people piece them together. That's the sort of thing that is ideal for a tablet. Increases engagement, and it's very much fitting with that mode, and it's not something anyone can really currently do. So those are the kinds of areas where we think that you'll be looking more at your tablet work to determine where are new features, what can be offered there.
But there is a certain amount of danger that comes with a lot of this thinking, which is thinking of these things as somehow some kind of separate item. And this is something we run into a lot, is that the client will call us up and say, we want to build a mobile app. And it's a completely separate team, a completely separate set of thinking to what's going on with the website. And the problem with this, we think, is that that's not how people want to experience interacting with a company. They want something much more that's much more thought through. And this leads to something that you hear a bunch of terms around it. One term that I've come across a fair bit that I think resonates fairly well is the idea of a transmedia application. That is thinking of the user experience, the application, the interaction you want to have as a single thing, even though it does cross multiple devices. And saying to yourself, how should the overall interaction of your customer be when, even though they're using a mobile some of the time, they're using a lean-back device some of the time, they're using a desktop some of the time. And how do you still make that one experience instead of 3 fragmented experiences? And this, of course, increases even more when you think of it in terms of the even wider range of devices. I mean, if somebody is using some in-car device in order to communicate with your company because maybe they're trying to find a gas station or something, if that's a mode of interaction that might appear, how does that, again, fit into the overall application? So what we feel is certainly on the user experience side of thinking about things, you shouldn't be thinking about individual devices. You should be thinking about the overall interaction that you have in order to carry out some form of interaction and activity within the organization.
And to turn that around and look at it from your user's point of view, they aren't going to see you as a collection of applications. That's not how the user thinks of you. They're going to see you as one application that is your product. And turning that around and understanding that from their point of view is what leads to this thinking. And that means you're in line with your users. You're not doing something that's going to make sense from your view of your technical landscape, but doesn't make sense because the user doesn't really know that actually, that system there, that data, that's built on that old system that we've got, that built in the 90s on COM. We've got to keep that running, we can't touch that. And over here, we've got this nice new CMS that's surfacing our Contact Us form, so it's a separate application, right? We keep those separate and distinct, not in the user's mind. And we've been heading in that direction, obviously, with our development for a number of years, and mobile has just really, really made this clear, that you could glue things together at the surface layer for a long time using some HTML and some CSS and sourcing things, but now that mobile applications have significantly different mechanisms for building those UIs, it's becoming harder and it's becoming more critical to think of a single application that is your product.
So that's what we have to say about product vision. Now we'll take a look at some guiding principles.
So guiding principles are an interesting one, and it always depends very much, and any effort to come up with guiding principles, you're going to have to do this yourself. The point of these is really about what are we going to use to react to the change that's going to be coming. As we build our application, as we head to that vision that's off in the future that we understand we'll never get to, we're never going to get there because change is going to happen all the time. Things are going to keep flowing in. As Luke said earlier today, it's a little bit trite, but that is inevitable. The guiding principles are there to make sure that we're reacting to that change in an intentional, thought-out way. So, having said that, you're going to have to come up with your own guiding principles. Here are a few that we like and we think are generally quite useful and are useful principles for coming up with principles. For example, test against the market. Don't think about your big dream that's going to take a long time to deliver and then deliver it all and then go, frequent, get in front of the people, test about it. And that's tapping that startup energy that your little offshoot Skunkworks mobile application team may have been exploiting for a little while. And the lean startup techniques are a great approach to doing this.
And this, of course, means embracing the fact that you expect things to go wrong a lot of times. If you're launching a whole bunch of initiatives and a significant proportion of them aren't failing, that implies you're not being innovative and creative enough. I've been quite aggressive with this when people have asked me and said, actually, most of what you do should fail. You should be experimenting with lots of different things, expecting plenty of them to fail, but then finding those that succeed and then following up from those.
And continuing with the theme of reacting to change and looking for failures, the best decision is the one that's easiest to change. And personally, I think this could be a great philosophy for life in general. But it also works nicely when you're testing and building out a mobile project. That when you've got a couple of decisions, a couple of branches that look like they're roughly equal as you weigh up the costs and benefits of them, as you do with all thinking, the one that locks you down the least, that's a big advantage there. That's a big extra piece of value that really should be considered. And finally, follow the value. That seems obvious, but there are some differences to it. So I want to talk about an example. I'll come back to this client that we're using this data for a little bit later. But it's a major US client that we have been working with for a little while now. And they have a business-to-consumer mobile application. They're a big organisation. I believe a few people in this audience have probably used their app. And they've got an Android app and an iOS app. And their shares of who's using those apps is roughly equal, which is in itself slightly unusual. If you've seen the difference in the market share of Android versus iOS, it should be roughly 75-25, but they're about equal. Still, that's okay. You treat the two platforms as equal, right? Well, that's the relative revenue difference. And it doesn't, like a lot of people see this and they go, well, why? Kind of doesn't matter why, as long as you know that that's true. And for them, it's true. This is directly measured. This data is from March this year. And it's relative, obviously. I'm not showing you actual revenue figures here. But that's roughly where things sit with them. And for whatever reason, iOS is, they're getting 7 times the revenue. Same or lower market share, but 7 times the revenue. And that's what we mean by follow the value. Now for them, iOS is clearly the most valuable. But for you, it might be Android, it might be mobile web, it might be tablet, it might even be the old laptop. But understanding where that value actually lies and chasing that we think is pretty critical.
So measuring traffic and eyeballs is sometimes what you want and is sometimes tied to revenue, but it isn't always. And you should always be focusing, what is our real goal? What's the main thing we're after? And targeting around that. So with that, we look at some of the thinking around our method for delivery. And basically this runs about the fact that most organisations, you're in a situation where you haven't got a lot of coverage across platforms and not a great user experience in terms of mobile approach. And what you want to be in a situation is where you're on all the platforms everybody wants to be, and you've also got a really awesome, fantastic experience in your application. The question is, how do you get from where you are to where you want to be? And we've kind of focused this in terms of 2 dimensions, as we'll explain as we develop. We begin by looking at the platform side of this. So when it looks at platforms, there's a reasonable list of platforms that people are considering as to which ones they ought to be building applications for. And we have a pretty firm opinion of which ones we think are worth looking at the moment, which is not going to surprise you having seen Horace's talk. Basically, BlackBerry, Windows Phone, thank you for playing, but you're not in the game. And I say this with some sadness because we have a colleague who's a big Apple fan, very keen on good user experience. He's had a Windows Phone, he loves it. He thinks it's much better than the Apple device, but effectively it doesn't matter because it's dying or gone. One thing to particularly note from this, though, is it's not just about Android and iOS. There is a very important third platform there, which is the web. And it actually occurred to me when watching Horace's talk earlier on, he was talking about take-up of platforms. I would have loved to have, I don't know how the hell you could have measured this, but I'd love to see the comparison of the web on that list. Because the web really is a dominantly powerful platform. And of course, any device that's got a decent browser, which is any device that wants to exist, is actually on that platform. You are going to reach people through the web. So the web is a particularly vital platform to consider. And I think it's important to think of it as a separate platform to Android and iOS because you want your interaction design and everything to work as a mobile website rather than just as an appendage or trying to make it look like Android and iOS is a bad idea.
People often ask, what should we do about BlackBerry and Windows Phone? Should we build native apps? And what should we do about the native apps we've built for Android and iOS? And one piece of advice that we can regularly give is that you really should be considering mobile web. Not only will it give you your BlackBerry and Windows Phone users something that they can use and that's well thought out and well engineered, but also you can use it to pick up all the Android and iOS users who haven't and probably never will install your native apps. Because that's a big market there. There's a lot of people who just won't. Every additional app is an extra cognitive load and they don't want to have to manage them.
A year ago, I ran into some guy who said that they were looking to build a native app for the BlackBerry, and they reckon it would actually be cheaper for them to buy all of their BlackBerry users an iPhone than it would be to build the BlackBerry app. But on the other hand, they had very important BlackBerry users. They felt they still had to go there in order to reach the people. This is a case, again, where the HTML5 can be very useful. The web app is a very nice approach.
One client took that a step further and projected at the point at which that would be cheaper to buy RIM and shut it down than to build a BlackBerry app. Perhaps a little bit aggressive.
So with that line of thinking, you begin to say, well, perhaps surely we should be mainly thinking about the web. If that reaches everywhere we want to be, why not be there? And that's why we have this second dimension on the graph, because we have to think in terms of user experience. And the reality is that you can get a nice user experience using HTML5 applications, usually a lot better than most people think, but you cannot get as nice an experience as you can get with a mobile app. There is that extra level of fit and finish. I mean, the nice gestures and things are much more difficult or even impossible to do on a web app, are trivially easy on a native app. So if you really want the user experience, you have to go native. Now that, of course, may mean you have to think about whether, how important it is to you to do that. And that becomes now just a question of how do we get from where we are into the zone of awesomeness. And basically, we identified two routes. The first route is what we call the laser route. And that is we decide, okay, there is one platform we are absolutely going to focus on first. We're going to do a really awesome job of providing the best possible user experience on that platform. And then we'll move to the other platforms as and when we think it's necessary. The other approach is the cover your bases approach. In that approach, you say, we want to get onto all of the platforms, get a reasonable user experience, but we're prepared to make lots of compromises in order to get the breadth. And then we'll gradually improve all of these platforms, perhaps in some kind of synchronized way, in order to get to where we want to be. And that gives us our two basic broad strategies. The question is, how do you choose between them? Giles.
And on the naming, I've been living in London for only 6 months now, and I understand that these names, Zone of Awesome, the Laser, Cover Your Bases, I will just say we were working in San Francisco at the time we came up with them, so they fit the climate there. Cover Your Bases is probably the easiest to understand and explain, so I'll start with that one. And that's, you're typically using that where you've got a large product that you're trying to get in front of your consumers, they're already interacting with it, they're already using it. And what you need to think about then is just making sure they've got that channel. So the app itself isn't the product, it's something else. It's tickets to travel, it's banking, it's things like that. And that's typically where we see this approach making the most sense. And what we talk about here is saying that it's about getting that coverage out there so your customers have that channel to work with your product, and then over time improving their experience of interacting with it. And as you're doing that, the main consideration you need to make is some form of predicting how much experience you're going to need into the future. Because you're probably going to pick some form of cross-platform technology to reduce your cost here. And so you just need to make sure that the technology you choose allows you to either raise the experience as high as you need it to be, or it allows you to bust through that experience without having to go back to scratch and build from scratch. So that's your primary consideration.
And it's worth bearing in mind that for some applications, you might say, I actually don't need the high-quality user experience that a native device will give me, in which case I can just concentrate on the web app approach, which is a kind of cover your bases, but with only one platform. And for some situations, that's reasonable. And a good example of this in this country is the government data services stuff, where they've said, we're not going to build apps. We're going to make data available if other people want to build apps on our data, but we're not going to actually build apps ourselves because we can provide a reasonable enough experience from the web app.
Now, with the laser strategy, you're going to be using this where your application really is the product. And we tend to see this a little bit less, but it is a very interesting one because it is this nice contrast. So I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with Instagram? No one know who Instagram is? Okay, right. So I like to use Instagram as an example for what this strategy could have looked like or could look like. So Instagram had a nice photo sharing application for the iPhone, for iOS. They've targeted that. They built, because they were targeting designers and people who were taking photos and cared about what photos could look like, they targeted just the one platform. And they built an application that was a nice experience for that platform. They trimmed it down. They didn't do general photo editing. They said just these simple filters that both were easy to use and worked within the constraints of the device, the iPhone's terrible camera at the time. And they built that out, and they managed to have a great, exploding, very large market user base who loved it, really committed fans. And people were asking, what are you going to do about Android? And their response was to ignore them for a while, then go away and do nothing apparently for between 3 to 6 months, and then release an Android app. And it appeared to make sense, but when you step back and look at it, what did they have at the end of that? They now had the same application on 2 platforms. So they're tapping into the large Android user base here, but they haven't got any new features, they haven't explored any new ways of interacting, they haven't opened up any potential for a revenue model. And at this point, this was before Facebook bought them, so revenue models now probably matter a lot less to them. So I like to think about what about another possible future for Instagram? So they've got their iPhone application, and part of that is sharing photos, exploring, having a look at those photos, and just dipping into the stream of what your friends have taken and shared recently. But that application is really quite terrible for exploring the world of photography in Instagram. And there are some beautiful photos out there if you go look, but it's really quite difficult to do that in their iPhone application. It's small, you keep having to tap things, it's not really an effective search, and you can't see a large photo, you can't really get the experience of it. What if instead of building that same application for Android, they'd gone and built a desktop web application? Now, building that, it's cheap. They've got the data. Skill set for HTML and JavaScript and things like that are widely available. Big chunks of Instagram app were already hybrid, so they had the skills in-house. Could have just done this. And it doesn't need to be a full massive feature set. It doesn't need to interact with photos and cameras and things like that. It's just exploring that data they already had. Effectively, it's just a new view. So you've now picked up one new platform. It's desktop web. Desktop web applications are typically quite easy to optimize to run as tablet web applications. They fit quite nicely on that screen and without making too many changes. So at that point, you picked up effectively 2 platforms. You can take a tablet web application and using hybrid techniques like PhoneGap and some other stuff, you can wrap that up and turn it into a native application. And the nice thing about doing that is you've now got access to that camera. And if it's an iPad native application, you've already got this big chunk of code just sitting over here that's doing all the camera photo acquisition. It's taking photos, it's managing that, it's applying filters, things like that. So now you've got an application on a tablet that's both allowing you to navigate the world of photos and also take and share new photos. I would recommend you probably don't release that particular application because it's kind of a bit of a weird hybrid. The other thing that a tablet and iPad was really good at is seeing a large photo and performing much more sophisticated photo editing. Has anyone used Snapseed from Google? It's a really quite nice free photo editing application for tablets. That's a great example of the sort of thing you could have done. So now at this point, not only do they have the original iPhone application, they've got a desktop web application that allows you to explore that network, which really taps the value of the network. And you can now release an iPad application that is allowing you to tap that value of that network and also take and share photos in a more sophisticated way. It's a divergent stream, but it's really looking at what are we doing with the devices we have and what are they good at and where could we exploit those inherent advantages.
And as another way of thinking the choice between these two, I'll summarise something that I picked up from an article from Giles, which is a way of thinking about it is, are you trying to, if the cover your bases approach works well when you're saying, we've got existing customers out there that have a relationship with us, and we want to maintain and deepen that relationship. In that case, breadth of platform reach is much more important than experience. Experience becomes a big factor when I want to get new customers. So I want to gather them towards us. Then we want to provide that kind of very rich experience to help do that.
And we're not going to, while we think that platform and experience are the two main things to consider, and they such main things when it comes to mobile application that they outweigh other considerations, there are other considerations. And we broadly break them down into about 3 areas that we typically look at when we're discussing these kinds of efforts with our clients. Firstly, your organisation, the in-house skills you've got, what existing systems you need to work with, those sorts of things. What are your capabilities and direction and appetite? What are your users like? Are they enterprise customers? Are they consumers? Are they other businesses? How market-driven are they? Is this, that sort of thing. And finally, the app itself. What's the intent of this app? Is it just to generate marketing buzz? Is it a long-lived workhorse that's going to become a significant part of people's day-to-day lives, or is it just something that people will dip in and out of occasionally? So there's a raft of things to consider, but we like to draw attention to platform and experience as we think they do outweigh the others when you're making these kinds of decisions. And now we're going to talk a little bit about a client case study. So this is a major US airline that have mobile applications across, I believe, all 4 of the main platforms now. And we've been working with them for a little over a year. So this mobile application they're talking about is a business to consumer. It's your main kind of retail travel airline application for this particular airline. So all the sorts of things you'd imagine, check-in, ticket purchase, flight status, schedule checks, stuff like that. It's all kind of, that's the sort of thing they all have now. When we started working with them, they were sort of in this state. They had 4 separate teams building 4 separate applications that shared a common feature set. And the 4 teams all came together at the same product ownership. So they had centralized product ownership, but that was on the business side, not on the technical side. The technical side was entirely 4 separate teams. And what the entire organisation, so this was much broader than mobile, what the entire organisation wanted to do and where the direction they were heading was they wanted a major visual redesign. So US air travel is a fairly utilitarian, commoditised market. This carrier regards themselves as differentiating on appearance and customer experience and things like that. So they knew, so while they already had the best looking website, they wanted it even better, and that was their goal. And they were thinking about what do we do? What's the solution and how do we approach this issue? We have 4 teams, 4 separate cost centers, building applications, costing us a lot of money. We want to make everything look different, but also all the same. What do we do? So over time, and we work with them, and this is what we suggested they do. It's a cover your bases approach from what we talked about before. And we suggested that BlackBerry and Windows Phone, yeah, again, thanks for playing, but not worth your reducing budget. If your budget is reduced, that's where you want to cut it off. And what we said instead is add in a mobile web application. They hadn't considered that. They were planning on using the desktop web and then pinch and pan and zoom. And we suggested that if you take Android and iOS and start applying hybrid techniques into those applications, and then start looking at what you can do in terms of reducing your feature pipelines to a series of much smaller, more frequent releases, using hybrid approaches to share technology back and forth, that hybrid technology will also support a web application, and that will support BlackBerry and Windows Phone, and also, again, the Android and iOS users who haven't and won't install the application. So it looked more like this as their development roadmap now. So Android and iOS are steadily converging in terms of what they're doing. And this has been really interestingly successful, actually. So they love it. It's cheaper. They get new features faster that look as good and feel as good as what previously cost a lot of native development effort. But there's another effect that we've seen where you talk to the business, and rather than focusing on colors and color schemes and font and things like that, which are important, they are now focusing more on what can we do in terms of travel products. And they're having sort of higher level conversations about where could we take this. It's like the part of their brain that was consumed with managing 4 teams and making sure they were using the right appearances has now been freed up to think about how can we do something new and innovative, which is kind of nice. And out of this effort, I don't know if many of you, I've spoken to some of you previously about this. There's now an open source project called Calatrava, supported by ThoughtWorks, but it's open source. That is a take on hybrid application development where it provides the ability to start with an HTML UI, but then replace that on a screen-by-screen, platform-by-platform basis when you need that extra bit of user experience performance, effectively. So that's up there on GitHub now. It's getting some good use and some interesting take-up from it. I believe there might be some people in this room who I don't recognise who are currently using it.
So that's the way in which we take a look at the mobile strategy at the moment. Now, of course, one of the things that should be very obvious to us by looking at the history that we saw earlier on this morning is that things change very, very fast. I don't think many people back in even 2005 would be saying they think Apple's going to be the major influencer in mobile phones. That came very much out of nowhere. We had tablets back then, but no one was really paying any serious attention to them. And the fact that tablets would become so big that they would be looking at displacing Windows, you'd be wondering what you'd be smoking if you were saying that kind of stuff back in 2005. So we are in an area of very rapid change. My personal feeling when we look at the platform line is that if we look 5 or 10 years out, it's likely that the mobile web will become very much the dominant platform. I say that not because I've done some clever analysis of the underlying features or the market fragmentation or whatever. I'm just doing my old trick of saying, well, history does tend to repeat itself. That's what happened on the desktop. We saw that the desktop applications became very much dominated by the web. And I suspect the same thing's going to happen to the mobile world as well. But it will take a while. It'll take maybe 5, maybe 10 years. And you can't afford to wait for that before it comes. So that does mean you're going to have to think about how do I deal with at least the 2 platforms that seem that they've got legs at the moment. But certainly I think the mobile web is a kind of a backbone strategy in that both currently and in the long term is going to play an important part.
And that's what we wanted to talk to you about today. Thank you.